Welcome back to American Christian or Christian American. Today we're going to be talking about freedom, and we're actually going to be talking about a particular freedom march. So I'm looking forward today, and we're just going to get into some documents and we're going to discuss them. All right, we're going to be talking about freedom and the freedom riders in the 1960s. To the left is John Lewis, who helped establish many things in this country. He was a freedom fighter, and along with other white people who went with him. So there were both black and white people fighting for the same thing. Because there were white people who did care, who did not believe in segregation, did not believe in the ill treatment of African Americans in this country, and many of them took beatings. John Lewis and James Zerwig, I'm not saying that right, I know, were both beaten unconscious. This took place here in Montgomery, Alabama. It says, when a young Southern Baptist preacher named Alan Cross arrived in Montgomery, Alabama in January 2000, he knew it was where Martin Luther King Jr. had his first church and where Rosa Parks launched her famous bus boycott. But he didn't know some other details of the city's role in the civil rights history. The more he learned, the more troubled he became by one event in particular, the savage attack, May 1961, on the busload of black and white freedom riders who had traveled defiantly together to Montgomery in a challenge to segregation. Over the next 15 years, Cross, who was white, would regularly take people to the old Greyhound depot in Montgomery to highlight what happened that spring. The pole is right here on the side, Cross says, standing in front of the depot, and it was quiet when they got off here. But then, once they started to get off the bus, around 500 people came out, men, women, and children. Men were holding the freedom riders back. The women were hitting them with purses and holding their children up to claw their faces. Some of the men carried lead pipes and baseball bats. Two of the freedom riders, civil rights activist John Lewis and a white ally, James Zerwig, were beaten unconscious. Though he had grown up in Mississippi and was familiar with the history of racial conflict in the South, Cross was horrified by the story of the 1961 attack on the freedom riders. Montgomery was known as a city of churches, fresh out of the seminary. Cross had come there to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why didn't Christians show up, he recalls, wondering. To his dismay, Cross learned that many of the people in the white mob, were themselves regular churchgoers. In the years that followed, he made it part of his ministry to educate his fellow Christians about the attack and prompt them to reflect on its meaning. We think about the South being Christian, but that wasn't Christianity, Cross says. So what happened here in the white church? How did we get to this point? In a question he explored in his 2014 book, When Heaven and Earth Collide, Racism, Southern Evangelicals, and the Better Way of Jesus. The answer to the question lies partly in U.S. history, beginning in the days of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, but not ending there. Elements of racist ideology have long been present in white Christianity in the United States. Racism from the pulpit. Less than 3 weeks after the 1961 on the Freedom Riders, Montgomery most prominent pastor Henry Lyon Jr. gave a fiery speech before the local White Citizens Council denouncing the civil rights protesters and the cause for which they were beaten. From a Christian perspective, ladies and gentlemen, for 15 years I have held the privilege of being pastor of a white Baptist church in this city, Lyon said. If we stand 100 years from now, it will still be a white church. I am a believer in the separation of the races, and I am none the less a Christian, the crowd applauded. If you want to get in the fight with one that started the separation of the races, then you come face with your God, he declared. The difference in color, the difference in our body, our minds, our life, our missions upon the face of this earth is God given. All right. Okay, so after looking at that document, let's talk about it. We have freedom riders who go to different places and go to Montgomery and other places to peacefully demonstrate for the equal rights of people. There are mostly African American, but there are several white Caucasian people who also attend these freedom riders because they believe in equality. They don't believe in people being treated different. So there were white people through history that stood up, even though they were overwhelmingly in the minority in many areas. There were white people who believed what is right, and there are today too. But we still face a huge opposition of those who continue to cling to racism and segregation. So look at these people here now. Along with John Lewis, James Zerig, I'm not saying that right, and I apologize for history. They were beaten unconscious. Who were they beaten unconscious by? People who claimed to be churchgoers, men, women, and teaching their children by holding them up so they can scratch the eyes and the faces of these freedom riders. This was Christianity at its best in these areas. But it wasn't Christianity. What it was as part of the evangelical movement. And really today, I believe that if you are an evangelical person who doesn't believe all this stuff, you need to pull away from that term and not use that term. Because most of the evangelical movement has been sinful and corrupt and evil. This goes back to the beginning of this country in slavery, but it goes back even farther than that. It goes back to Catholicism. When Catholicism was the first Christian nationalism, we're bringing the political idea together with the religious to make an awesome power. But it wasn't about pleasing God. It was about power. They twisted the word of God in order to mean what they wanted it to. And then generation after generation, they indoctrinated children to believe these things in those years where they're formative years, where they're being taught how to interpret everything around them. We not only learn languages between 0 to 6, that's when we form our native languages. Anything after 6, right around that period, our mind no longer thinks the same way. It interprets new things through, let's say, our mental library. And the language that we've established, we will add vocabulary in there and interpret it through what we knew during those first formative 6 years of our life. If we decide to learn another language, if it's after age 6, we will be translating it through our mental library. In other words, it's a second language. Now, if you were exposed to the workings of 2 different languages before age 6, then you would literally have 2 native languages, and you could think in those languages. But see, it goes beyond that. It goes on our habits and the way we interact. Everything happens in those first 6 years. It's not that you can't change, but it is difficult. We have to fight that preconceived notions that we have, which is set up by God, a natural way to do it, but when it's damaged by these evil things, we have to fight a little harder to try to say, no, what I would learn when I was younger is not right. Then we have a preacher, Mr. Lyons here, who gets up and says, God created the races. He created one race, one human race, not more than one, because we are all 99.9% identical. Again, go back to my first video and look that up and see what I talk about there. We were not light-skinned people. We were darker, medium brown people because they're the only people who are able to create all different shades of people because there was only one creation. It was not a curse. And even the curse that existed was not about pigmentation. And it wasn't even on Ham, as they talk about. It was on Canaan. All right. So we have hatred and evil things being preached by people who are supposed to be preaching the word of God in love and compassion and teach, but that's not what they were doing. They were teaching evil, and they were teaching power, and they were teaching conquest. Let's go back even to Israel. Israel was a theocracy at first. Theo meaning God, and ocracy like example like democracy, theocracy. Theocracy meaning led completely by God. But then Israel wanted a king. Now, it's not what God wanted, but he gave him a king. He allowed them to have a king, and Saul, and then David, and then so on down the lines. When they got kings, they were in trouble. Sometimes the kings were good, and sometimes the kings were not so good. In fact, they were downright evil. It shows you that when religion comes together with political aspirations, the power factor is in there, and we don't do so well. When the church was established, it was established to function within other nations. It was not established to be a political situation, although it's not that we shouldn't have impact on politics. Look at the idea of, again, we've got Catholicism, which brought those two things together. And Catholicism ended up being actually committed many, many murders in the idea of God forcing people to convert. It instituted slavery, which we talked about, that it gave justification for it. Catholicism had power over the whole world. No king would dare defy the Pope until, of course, King Henry VIII, when he separated the Church of England from Catholicism in order to get a divorce, because the Pope wouldn't grant him one. But it was the same situation. Again, political power in with the church. Now, even though Protestant churches spread out throughout the world, and they still carried on this idea of white is right, white supremacy, white people were first, black people were cursed, and they carried on this incredible garbage. We talked about the Moors. The Moors were dark-skinned people. They were always referred to black African people, sometimes compared to Cushites, with Ethiopians with very, very dark skin. Extremely, the darkest skin that we know in the world today. And then there were variations, and they were also referred to a reddish brown. These weren't white people. After the 12th century, people started to say the Moors were white because they wanted to cover up history. These people who conquered Spain set up 17 universities, and we talked about this and evidences I provided in a previous video, just a couple of videos back. So go and look at that. But they brought the numbering system that came from Arab and Indian influence. So we had, in Europe, had Roman numerals. They weren't that efficient. What we use today didn't come from white people. It came from Arabic and others through the Moors into Europe. So in Europe, had to go to black universities in order to become superior. We're not superior. We're not better. We're not less either. We're something special, human beings, just like everybody else. But Europeans have spewed out so much hatred because they followed power structures. And guess what, folks? It's happening today. We've got it in Washington, D.C. The white nationalist evangelical churches have elected Donald Trump. There were some other people that helped, but they were the core. They are the core of MAGA. In other words, we're going to look at some other factors in the future here where the KKK was prominently evangelicals. So we have the KKK, the neo-Nazis, the Proud Boys. In other words, we have MAGA. They may not always call themselves the exact same things, but they are the exact same thing. Now, they may not commit as many atrocities as they have in the past because certain laws are in place. But with this administration, how long will those laws be in place? What will be rolled back next? They roll back DEI programs, things that can help people with equal rights What will be taken away next? The thing is, they're not just about that. They want to harm Social Security. They want to harm Medicare because they want to keep people down. They want to keep the power and control. And what they are talking about is they would prefer to have a Christian king as opposed to democracy. They don't believe in democracy. And even they were part of what helped establish this country. And democracy was not set up to function that well. I mean, there were hints of it, but we modified many things in democracy to make it better. We're still a long ways from what it really should be. This should be about, the country should be about equalization of people. The church should be about focusing on love and passion and compassion and reaching all people. Okay? This is not about just one group of people. And if you hate people in your heart, you look down on people, you've gone the opposite way of God. You cannot follow God and be hateful and hurt people. You cannot follow God and beat someone with a club. You cannot follow God and deny people their rights. You cannot follow God and sit here and spit on people. You cannot follow God and deny them their humanity. You cannot follow God and be an evangelical who hates people and people who do not look like them. Let's understand, folks. In 1973, when Roe versus Wade was passed, the evangelicals did not respond to that until 5 years later. They were focused on segregation. That was what their main things, keeping black people at bay. But 5 years later, they took up Roe versus Wade, anti-abortion. Now, I'm not saying I'm for abortion, but I don't believe abortion is right. But I also don't believe the government should be involved. Now, they didn't take it up for 5 years. Why? Because it wasn't really a concern for them. What was concerned about keeping people separate. Now they use abortion so they can bring more people in. More people who don't study enough to know what they're doing is wrong. More people who just kind of live their lives and they don't really learn about what black people or African American people or Asian people or Native American people in this country have to go through on a daily basis. They just say, well, that was in the past. They should just get over it. It's not in the past. And then they shouldn't just get over it. The country needs to go beyond it. Then maybe we can be over it. But history should never be forgotten. Because if history is forgotten, it will be repeated. Because we have to face it, people. Human beings are sinful people. And if we don't keep people understanding God's love, who He is, what the purpose is, then people who hate and people who don't want to do right will come back and be stronger again. When we leave this earth, if we follow God, we will have peace and love and temptation will be gone. But as long as we live here, as long as human beings have the capability to do things that are hateful, to do things that are wrong, we're going to be faced with that. You can't live your life without standing up for it. If you live your life and you say, I'm just trying to get by, you won't get by that well because the opposition will always stand up against you. Whether you're white, black, or otherwise, if you're poor, even if you're making some good money, there are people above you who will do you harm because they want more. Let's just face it. If every single person who was not white, including the Native Americans, left this country, the poor white people would be next, and then the middle class would be next. Because the power structure always has to have somebody to abuse and put down. So why don't we just work together? Because I don't want to be in a country that's all white. I want to be in a country that has diversity, that has different perspectives. I want to be in a country that has deaf people, hearing people, African Americans, Asian people. I want to understand things from all different people's side, but always led by God and His Word. I know that no matter what we read in His Word, that it's always centered around love. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't talk about morality, sexual responsibility, and these other things, but they're all based on love. They're not just rules off to the side. It's because we love God that we want to please Him and do what's right. And He tells us what we need to do. Why? Because He knows what's right for us. Do you know what's right for you? Have you read God's word? Are you still hateful? Are you still not hateful? Oh, you like some people, but you just don't understand them. And you can't understand it from one person. And you say, well, I have a black friend. Well, people say that. But do you understand that black friend? Do you really? Have you taken time to listen to them? Have you taken time to understand what they go through on a daily basis? And I don't mean just by keeping quiet air. Have you asked them with sincerity? Because they may not feel that you're open to it. And, really, how much do they consider you a friend? Because if you are a friend, they can talk openly about what they go through. It doesn't mean that you don't go through things, and people should listen to you as well. But why is it that white people want to be understood and they don't want to understand other people? All of us have pain and struggles, and it isn't about who has more. It's about understanding each other and realizing that each of us have pain, and what it's really about is how we feel about ourselves through that pain. But if you're Caucasian and you feel like you should be understood, and you should be willing to understand other people who go things probably that you don't go through. You see, every individual person faces trauma, but we're talking about a group of people who face a group trauma, not just an individual trauma, a group trauma. And I want you to think about this. White children through racism have been traumatized as well. When parents take their children and force them to abuse, scratch the eyes of somebody else, that's trauma. That's abuse to those children because you're scarring these children with hate. And they'll grow up to think that way. Hopefully they'll break through. But you're scarring them. You're forcing them to draw out hate when what they need is love. When will we follow God? When will we do what's right? Till the next time on American Christian and Christian American.